7th of July 1937, China. Japanese forces clash with Chinese troops near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, igniting a full-scale war that will consume millions of lives across Asia. The conflict transforms Japan's military medical establishment into something far darker than healing. Medicine becomes a weapon, research becomes torture, and doctors begin to see human subjects not as patients, but as raw material for experiments that serve the empire's goals. Hospitals and laboratories operate under military authority, where obedience to the state eclipses all ethical constraint. While some physicians embrace this shift because it aligns with their beliefs about Japanese superiority and racial destiny, others are drawn in gradually by opportunity, funding, and the promise of scientific advancement that civilian practice could never offer. Under these conditions, the line separating medical research from mass murder disappears entirely. One ambitious army physician will build an entire complex devoted to biological warfare protocol that kill thousands of prisoners, and after Japan's defeat, he will walk free because of a single secret agreement with the occupying power. His name is Shiro Ishii. Shiro Ishii was born on 25th of June 1892 in the village of Chiyoda, located in Chiba Prefecture on Japan's main island. He came from a prosperous landowning family during a period when Japan was rapidly modernizing its military, economy, and educational system. The nation had recently defeated Russia in war and was asserting itself as a rising power in East Asia. Young men from families like Ishii's saw the military as a path to prestige, influence, and service to the emperor. Ishii studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, one of Japan's most elite institutions, and graduated in 1920. He was intelligent, charismatic, and deeply ambitious, qualities that helped him stand out among his peers. After completing his degree, Ishii joined the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps and quickly began climbing its ranks. He specialized in bacteriology and serology, fields that were gaining strategic importance as nations prepared for future conflicts. In 1928, Ishii was sent abroad on a 2-year research tour, visiting military and medical facilities across Europe and North America. During this journey, he studied how other countries were developing chemical and biological weapons, despite international treaties that banned their use. When he returned to Japan, Ishii was convinced that tactical bacteriology represented the future of military power, particularly for a resource-limited nation like Japan. He argued that germs and diseases could be weaponized cheaply, deployed silently, and spread devastation across enemy populations without requiring the industrial capacity needed for conventional arms. His superiors listened carefully. Japan's military leadership was already preparing for expanded conflict across the Asian mainland, and Ishii's vision aligned with their goals. The world Ishii operated within was shaped by aggressive militarism and imperial expansion. Japan in the 1930s was dominated by military factions that viewed war as necessary and inevitable. Democratic institutions had weakened, political opponents were silenced, and nationalist ideology permeated schools, media, and public life. The military presented itself as the defender of Japan's honor and the engine of its destiny. Civilians were taught to sacrifice for the empire, to obey without question, and to view conquered peoples as inferior races destined for subjugation. Economic pressure intensified this atmosphere. Japan lacked natural resources, particularly oil and metals, which made territorial expansion seem like survival rather than aggression. When the Great Depression struck in the early 1930s, unemployment rose and social unrest grew, further empowering those who promised strength through conquest. Against this backdrop, atrocities committed in the name of national interest were rationalized as unfortunate necessities or dismissed entirely. Soldiers and officers who questioned orders risked disgrace or worse. Research that violated medical ethics could be justified as patriotic duty, particularly if it promised military advantage. Ishii thrived in this environment. His confidence, his willingness to pursue research others considered taboo, and his close connections within the military hierarchy gave him extraordinary freedom. By the early 1930s, he had secured approval and funding to establish a covert biological warfare research program. In 1932, Japan invaded Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China, and established a puppet state called Manchukuo. The occupation provided territory far from Japan's home islands, where secret military projects could operate without scrutiny from the international community. Ishii was assigned to lead the biological warfare research effort, and in 1936, construction began on a vast complex near the city of Harbin in the district of Pingfang. The facility was officially designated Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, but it became known simply as Unit 731. The name was bland and bureaucratic, designed to conceal its true purpose. The complex eventually covered 6 square kilometers and included laboratories, barracks, administrative buildings, crematoria, and cells for prisoners who would serve as human test subjects. Thousands of staff worked there, including doctors, scientists, technicians, and soldiers. Funding flowed steadily from the military budget, and Ishii was granted autonomy to pursue whatever research he deemed necessary. His mandate was clear: develop biological weapons that could be deployed against Japan's enemies and test them to determine their effectiveness. To accomplish this, he needed human subjects, and the war in China provided an endless supply. The test subjects were drawn primarily from the civilian population of occupied China and from prisoners of war: Chinese resistance fighters, suspected spies, criminals, and ordinary civilians caught in the wrong place were arrested by the Kempeitai, Japan's military police, and transported to Unit 731. Soviet prisoners, Mongolians, Koreans, and even some Allied individuals held at the facility of war were also sent to the facility. Once inside, they were stripped of their names and referred to by the staff as maruta, a Japanese word meaning logs, as if they were nothing more than timber to be processed. This dehumanization was deliberate. It allowed doctors and researchers to conduct procedure without confronting the humanity of their subjects. Records were falsified or destroyed to hide what was happening. Families were never informed. The victims simply disappeared into the complex, and most never emerged alive. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 covered a wide range of biological and medical research, all designed to serve military objectives. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases, including plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and smallpox, to study the progression of illness and test potential treatments or vaccines. The infections were introduced through contaminated food, water, injections, or by releasing disease-carrying fleas and insects into cells. Researchers observed the individuals held at the facility as they sickened and died, documenting symptoms, timelines, and mortality rates with clinical detachment. No anesthesia was provided. No consent was sought. The suffering was immense, but it was treated as data. Some victims were subjected to vivisections, surgical procedures performed on living subjects without pain relief, so that researchers could examine the effects of disease on internal organs in real time. These procedures were not intended to save lives. They were intended to gather information before the subject died. Ishii and his staff justified this by arguing that autopsies performed after death provided less useful data because bodily processes had already ceased. Other experiments tested the limits of human endurance under extreme conditions. Prisoners were exposed to freezing temperatures to study frostbite and determine the most effective methods for treating soldiers injured by cold. Victims were taken outside during winter, exposed to sub-zero environments to track the progression of necrosis. The objective was to refine rewarming protocols for soldiers, though the methodology ignored all standards of medical ethics. Some victims had frozen limbs amputated while still alive to observe wound response and infection patterns. High-pressure and low-pressure experiments were conducted to simulate conditions pilots and submariners might encounter. Inmates were placed in chambers monitoring the physiological reactions of the human body to extreme atmospheric shifts. These trials were documented with clinical detachment, focusing on the points of total systemic collapse to aid in aeronautical military research. Dehydration studies forced victims to go without water for extended periods to measure how long soldiers could survive without access to fluids. Researchers also conducted non-human fluid transfusion trials to study survival metrics. None of these experiments were designed to benefit the subjects. They were designed to benefit the empire. Weapons testing formed another core area of research. Inmates were exposed to grenades, flamethrowers, and chemical agents to evaluate their effectiveness against human targets. Some were tied to stakes at varying distances from explosions to measure blast radius and shrapnel penetration. Others were locked in chambers and exposed to poison gas to observe its effects on respiratory and nervous systems. Unit 731 also developed biological bombs designed to spread plague-infected fleas over enemy territory. These weapons were tested on prisoners, and later they were deployed in actual military operations across China. Between 1940 and 1942, Japanese forces conducted at least a dozen biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities, contaminating water supplies and dropping plague-laden materials from aircraft. The exact death toll remains unknown, but estimates range into the tens of thousands when secondary outbreaks are included. The experiments and attacks were not isolated acts of individual cruelty. They were institutionally supported, funded, and directed by Japan's military command structure. Unit 731 was not a rogue operation. It was an official program. The scale of suffering at Unit 731 is difficult to comprehend fully because many records were destroyed before Japan's surrender. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 3,000 people were killed directly through experiments at the Pingfang complex, though some historians believe the true number is significantly higher, possibly exceeding 10,000 when deaths at related satellite facilities are included. Unit 731 was not the only site conducting such research. The program included more than a dozen affiliated units scattered across occupied territories, including Unit 100, which focused on agricultural and livestock tactical bacteriology, and Unit 516, which specialized in chemical weapons. Together, These facilities employed thousands of personnel and consumed substantial resources. Among the inmates held at Unit 731, terror spread quickly. Survivors who were later liberated or escaped described an atmosphere of absolute helplessness. Victims knew that once they were selected for a procedure, they would not return. Some tried to resist or refuse, but punishment was swift and brutal. Others attempted suicide to escape the inevitable. The facility operated with industrial efficiency, processing human lives as if they were materials in a factory. The doctors and scientists who worked there were not monsters from outside society. They were trained professionals, many educated at Japan's finest universities, who had chosen to place national ambition above human decency. Shiro Ishii directed the system with absolute authority. He was a skilled administrator and a persuasive advocate for his work within the military hierarchy. He cultivated relationships with powerful figures in Tokyo, secured consistent funding, and defended his program against occasional criticism from those who questioned its costs or ethics. Ishii was also personally involved in some of the experiments, observing procedures and reviewing results. His charisma and confidence helped maintain morale among his staff, many of whom might otherwise have questioned what they were doing. He framed the work as scientific progress and patriotic service, and most of his subordinates accepted this framing without protest. Some researchers genuinely believed they were advancing medical knowledge. Others simply followed orders. A few enjoyed the power they held over helpless prisoners. Whatever their individual motivations, the result was the same: systematic murder disguised as research. By 1945, Japan's military position had collapsed. American forces had recaptured territory across the Pacific, bombed Japanese cities into ruin, and imposed a naval blockade that strangled the nation's economy. The Soviet Union, which had remained neutral in the Pacific conflict, prepared to enter the war against Japan. Defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. Ishii and his staff understood what this meant. If Japan surrendered and foreign forces occupied the country, the activities at Unit 731 would likely be exposed. Evidence of pathogen research and human experimentation could lead to war crimes, prosecutions similar to those unfolding in Europe, where Nazi leaders and doctors were being held accountable for atrocities committed during the Holocaust. Ishii began planning to conceal what had happened. In early August 1945, as Japan's government debated surrender terms following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Ishii issued orders to destroy Unit 731. The complex was systematically dismantled. Buildings were blown up, equipment was smashed, and documents were burned. Remaining prisoners were killed to eliminate witnesses, and their bodies were cremated or buried. Staff members were instructed to return to Japan and remain silent about their work. Some records and biological samples were smuggled out and hidden. Ishii himself fled back to Japan and went into hiding, hoping to avoid capture in the chaos of surrender. Japan announced its unconditional surrender on 15 August 1945, and American occupation forces began arriving shortly afterward. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers and tasked with overseeing Japan's demilitarization, democratization, and reconstruction. The occupation authorities faced enormous challenges: a devastated economy, millions of displaced people, a shattered military, and a population exhausted by years of war. Amid this upheaval, the question of accountability for war crimes became urgent. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly known as the Tokyo Trials, was established to prosecute Japanese leaders responsible for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The tribunal's work began in 1946 and would eventually involve dozens of defendants and thousands of pages of evidence. However, the Tokyo trials focused primarily on military and political leaders who had planned and directed Japan's aggressive wars. The full scope of Unit 731's activities remained hidden from public view and largely absent from the tribunal's proceedings. American intelligence officers had begun hearing rumors about Japanese biological warfare research even before the occupation formally started. Reports came from multiple sources: liberated prisoners of war, Chinese resistance groups, and Japanese defectors who sought favor with the occupying authorities. Investigators followed these leads cautiously, uncertain what they would find. In September 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, a microbiologist and expert in pathogen research working for the U.S. Army, arrived in Japan with orders to assess Japanese capabilities in this field. Sanders interviewed Japanese scientists and military officers, including some who had worked in related programs. Many denied knowledge of human experiments or provided vague, incomplete answers. Sanders suspected he was not receiving the full truth, but he lacked sufficient evidence to compel cooperation. Then, in early 1946, a Soviet war crimes trial held in Khabarovsk put a small number of captured Japanese personnel on trial for biological warfare crimes. The Soviets had captured some members of Unit 731 during their invasion of Manchuria, and the trial revealed disturbing details about experiments on human subjects and the use of biological weapons against Chinese civilians. This public exposure alarmed American authorities, not because they were shocked by the crimes, but because they feared losing access to valuable intelligence. The United States military had its own biological warfare research program based at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and officials there understood immediately that Unit 731's experiments, however unethical, had produced data that could not be obtained any other way. American researchers had conducted some animal studies and limited field tests, but they had never infected human subjects with plague or anthrax or tested biological weapons on living prisoners. The Japanese had done all of this, systematically and at scale, and they possessed years of detailed findings. In the emerging Cold War environment, where the United States and Soviet Union were rapidly becoming adversaries, American military planners wanted that information. They did not want the Soviets to acquire it exclusively, and they did not want it revealed in international courts where it might complicate occupation policy or embarrass the United States. A decision was made at the highest levels of the American command structure: offer immunity to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for complete disclosure of their research. The negotiations began quietly in 1946 and intensified through 1947. American interrogators, led by scientists and intelligence officers rather than prosecutors, tracked down former Unit 731 members and offered them protection from war crimes trials if they cooperated fully. Shiro Ishii, who had been hiding under a false identity, was located and brought in for questioning. He initially provided limited information, testing whether the Americans were genuinely interested in scientific exchange or simply gathering evidence for prosecution. Once he understood that immunity was possible, his cooperation expanded dramatically. Other key figures from Unit 731 followed the same pattern. They withheld information until they received assurances, then opened their files and memories in exchange for safety. The Americans wanted written reports, experimental data, photographs, and detailed explanations of methodology. They wanted to know which diseases were most effective as weapons, how they spread, what doses were lethal, and how long victims survived. They wanted to understand delivery mechanisms, environmental factors, and defensive measures. In short, they wanted everything Unit 731 had learned from years of human experimentation. The deal was never formalized in a single public document. Instead, it emerged through a series of confidential agreements, classified reports, and tacit understandings between American occupation authorities and Japanese researchers. Lieutenant Colonel Arvo T. Thompson and Dr. Norbert Fell, both involved in biological warfare intelligence gathering, played central roles in the interrogations and information exchange. Edwin Hill, the chief of basic sciences at Fort Detrick, traveled to Japan in 1947 to personally interview Ishii and other Unit 731 veterans. Hill's mission was to evaluate the quality and usefulness of the data being offered, and to recommend whether the deal should proceed. His conclusion was clear: the information was valuable, possibly unique, and worth protecting the sources from prosecution. Hill reported back to his superiors that the Japanese data represented years of research that would be impossible to replicate ethically and extremely costly to obtain through animal studies or other means. He argued that keeping this information out of Soviet hands justified the moral compromise of granting immunity. The exchange moved forward. Japanese researchers prepared detailed reports summarizing their experiments, including infection rates, mortality statistics, symptom progressions, and weapon effectiveness assessments. Some of these reports ran to hundreds of pages and included charts, graphs, and photographs. American officials classified the materials immediately upon receipt and restricted access to a small circle of military scientists and intelligence analysts. The information was never shared with the prosecutors working on the Tokyo trials, and no mention of Unit 731's full activities appeared in that tribunal's proceedings. A few lower-ranking Japanese officers were prosecuted by the Soviets in the Khabarovsk trial, but Ishii and the senior leadership of Unit 731 remained beyond reach. They had traded their knowledge for their freedom, and the American occupation authorities honored that bargain. The justification offered internally was strategic necessity. American officials argued that the information would advance defensive research, help protect U.S. troops in future conflicts, and prevent the Soviets from gaining an advantage in biological warfare capabilities. These arguments persuaded those who needed persuading, and objections were brushed aside or silenced. The consequences of this deal extended far beyond the individuals it protected. By shielding Unit 731 personnel from prosecution, the United States allowed perpetrators of mass atrocities to escape justice and reintegrate into Japanese society. The decision also meant that victims received no acknowledgement, no apology, and no compensation. Chinese survivors and the families of those who died at Unit 731 were denied the opportunity to confront their tormentors in court or to see the truth documented in an official legal proceeding. The Tokyo trials prosecuted Japanese leaders for waging aggressive war and for specific atrocities such as the Nanjing massacre, but the systematic medical experimentation carried out by Unit 731 remained largely invisible to the international community for decades. This silence shaped historical memory in profound ways. Many Japanese citizens were unaware of Unit 731's existence until investigative journalists and historians began uncovering the story in the 1980s. Textbooks avoided the subject. Official records remained classified or destroyed, and public discourse focused on Japan's suffering during the war rather than the suffering Japan inflicted on others. The absence of legal accountability made it easier to deny, minimize, or ignore what had happened. Shiro Ishii lived quietly in post-war Japan. He was never charged with war crimes, never stood trial, and never faced public condemnation for his role in the deaths of thousands. After fulfilling his obligations to American intelligence, he returned to private life and worked as a consultant. Some sources indicate he continued advising on biological and medical matters, though the details of his post-war activities remain somewhat obscure. He maintained relationships with former colleagues from Unit 731, many of whom also rebuilt successful careers in medicine, academia, and industry. Ishii died of throat cancer on 9 October 1959 at the age of 67. His death was noted briefly in Japanese newspapers, described simply as the passing of a former army doctor. No mention was made of Unit 731 or the experiments conducted under his command. He never expressed remorse publicly, and there is no evidence he felt any privately. To the end, he appears to have viewed his work as a legitimate contribution to Japan's wartime efforts and as valuable scientific research that had been misunderstood by those unfamiliar with military necessity. Other members of Unit 731 followed similar paths. Many returned to prominent positions in post-war Japanese society, protected by the same bargain that shielded Ishii. Dr. Masaji Kitano, who succeeded Ishii as commander of Unit 731 in 1942, became a respected figure in medical circles after the war. He founded the Green Cross Corporation, a pharmaceutical company that grew into one of Japan's leading blood product manufacturers. Kitano never faced charges and died in 1986 without public accountability. Dr. Ryoichi Naito, another Unit 731 veteran, also played a founding role in the Green Cross Corporation and became a wealthy businessman. His past remained hidden from most of his colleagues and clients. Dr. Hisato Yoshimura, who conducted freezing experiments on prisoners at Unit 731, returned to academic life and eventually became a professor at Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. He published research on cold weather physiology without acknowledging that his data came from lethal experiments on unwilling human subjects. His academic reputation remained intact throughout his career. Across multiple sectors of post-war Japan, former Unit 731 personnel occupied positions of influence and respectability. Some worked in public health agencies, advising on infectious disease control and sanitation policy. Others taught at medical schools, training the next generation of Japanese physicians. A few entered private practice or pharmaceutical research, applying knowledge gained through atrocities to commercial purposes. The network of former Unit 731 members remained loosely connected, and many helped each other secure positions or avoid scrutiny. This was possible because the American occupation had effectively sealed the records and prevented prosecution. Without official charges or convictions, there was no formal stain on these men's reputations, no public documentation of their crimes, and no mechanism for accountability. Japanese authorities, focused on rebuilding the nation and maintaining stability during the occupation, had little incentive to pursue investigations that might embarrass powerful figures or complicate relations with the United States. The families of victims faced a much harsher reality. Thousands of Chinese civilians and captives who disappeared into Unit 731 were never accounted for. Their relatives received no notification of death, no remains to bury, and no explanation of what had happened. In the chaos of post-war China, where civil war resumed between communist and nationalist forces, many families had no means to investigate or demand answers. Survivors who had witnessed atrocities or lost loved ones carried their trauma in silence, unable to access justice or recognition. Some tried to speak out, but their testimonies were dismissed or ignored by authorities more concerned with geopolitical stability than with individual suffering. The Chinese government, initially focused on internal struggles and later on relations with the United States and Japan, did not prioritize the issue of Unit 731 for many years. It was only decades later, as diplomatic tensions shifted and historical research expanded, that official attention returned to these crimes. The secrecy surrounding Unit 731 began to crack in the 1980s, when Japanese journalists and historians started publishing investigations based on interviews with former staff members and survivors. Journalist Akira Makino and historian Keiichi Tsuneshi were among the first to expose the full scope of Unit 731's activities to the Japanese public. Their work faced resistance from some quarters, including pressure from veterans groups and conservative politicians who argued that dwelling on wartime atrocities harmed Japan's international standing and dishonored the memory of soldiers. However, the evidence was overwhelming, and public awareness gradually increased. Survivors from China came forward with testimony, and archived documents from both American and Japanese sources were declassified or leaked. The accumulated weight of this evidence made denial impossible, Though debate over responsibility, scale, and appropriate remembrance continues in Japan to this day. In China, Unit 731 became a focal point for discussions of wartime memory and historical justice. Museums and memorials were established at the site of the Pingfang complex near Harbin, where the remains of the facility still stand. These institutions document the experiments, honor the victims, and educate visitors about the atrocities committed there. Chinese textbooks and official narratives emphasize Unit 731 as evidence of Japanese wartime aggression and the suffering inflicted on the Chinese people. For some Chinese citizens, particularly those with family connections to victims, the lack of accountability remains a source of deep anger and frustration. Efforts to seek reparations or official apologies from the Japanese government have largely been unsuccessful, complicated by broader diplomatic tensions and differing interpretations of history. Japanese courts have occasionally heard cases brought by Chinese survivors or their descendants, but most have been dismissed on procedural grounds or statute of limitations arguments. No Japanese government has issued a comprehensive official apology specifically for Unit 731's crimes, though some individual politicians have acknowledged the unit's existence and expressed regret in general terms. The contrast with other post-war justice efforts is striking. In Europe, the Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi doctors who conducted experiments in concentration camps, establishing legal and ethical principles that shaped international human rights law for generations. The Nuremberg Code, formulated in response to evidence presented during those trials, became the foundation for modern medical ethics and informed consent requirements. Doctors who participated in Nazi experiments were held individually accountable, and their crimes were documented in exhaustive detail. Some were executed, others imprisoned, and the historical record was preserved for future generations. In Asia, however, the pursuit of justice followed a different path. The Tokyo trials prosecuted political and military leaders for crimes against peace and specific war crimes, but biological warfare experiments were deliberately excluded from the proceedings. The American decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 personnel meant that an entire category of atrocity escaped legal scrutiny at the highest international level. This inconsistency was not accidental. It reflected strategic priorities that placed Cold War competition above universal accountability. American officials who defended the decision argued that the intelligence gained from Unit 731 enhanced national security and potentially saved lives by improving defensive measures against biological attack. Some claimed that the data helped develop vaccines or treatments that benefited public health. These justifications have been disputed by historians and ethicists who examined the actual documents transferred from Unit 731 to American researchers. Many experts concluded that the scientific value of the data was limited because the experiments were poorly designed, inadequately documented, and conducted under conditions that made reliable conclusions difficult. The research was driven by military objectives rather than rigorous scientific methodology, and much of it confirmed information that was already known or could have been obtained through ethical means. The claim that the deal was necessary for national security appears weaker when the quality of the information is assessed honestly. What is clear is that the decision to grant immunity protected war criminals from justice and denied victims any possibility of redress through official channels. The moral cost of this choice extends beyond the individuals directly involved. It established a precedent that scientific or strategic value could justify immunity for atrocities, a principle that undermines the universality of human rights and the rule of law. It demonstrated that justice could be selective, applied to some perpetrators, but not others depending on political calculations. It also contributed to a climate in which historical truth could be suppressed or manipulated for diplomatic convenience. For decades, the full story of Unit 731 remained hidden, not because evidence was lacking, but because powerful governments chose secrecy over accountability. This silence allowed distorted narratives to persist and deprived victims of recognition. The eventual exposure of Unit 731's crimes came not through official processes, but through the persistence of journalists, historians, and survivors who refused to let the truth remain buried. The deal between American authorities and Unit 731 was not an isolated case. It fit within a broader pattern of post-war pragmatism that prioritized perceived strategic advantage over moral consistency. Across occupied territories, the United States and other allied powers made similar calculations, recruiting scientists, intelligence officers, and technical experts whose skills were deemed valuable despite their involvement in war crimes or collaboration with enemy regimes. Operation Paperclip brought German rocket scientists and engineers to the United States, including individuals who had used forced labor from concentration camps. Many of these recruits were quietly granted security clearances and integrated into American military and space programs. Their pasts were sanitized or classified, and questions about their wartime activities were discouraged. The same logic applied in Japan, where the United States sought to preserve useful assets and deny them to the Soviet Union. Unit 731 represented one piece of this larger strategy, but it was perhaps the most morally stark because the crimes involved were so transparently indefensible and the victims so numerous. The Soviet Union pursued its own version of this approach, extracting scientists and technical knowledge from occupied territories and offering selective leniency to those who cooperated. The Khabarovsk trial, which exposed some Unit 731 activities, served Soviet propaganda purposes as much as justice, highlighting Japanese and American collaboration while obscuring the Soviet Union's own willingness to compromise principles when expedient. In this environment, post-war justice became a selective exercise, shaped by geopolitical competition rather than universal standards. Some perpetrators faced accountability while others were protected, and the determining factor was often utility rather than guilt. This inconsistency weakened the moral authority of the entire post-war legal framework and raised questions about whether international justice could ever be applied fairly when powerful states controlled the process. Decades after the war, as scholars gained access to declassified documents, the full extent of American knowledge about Unit 731 became clear. Internal memos and reports revealed that officials understood they were protecting individuals responsible for torture and mass murder. Some documents expressed discomfort with the arrangement, but these concerns were overridden by military and intelligence priorities. The justifications offered in these classified communications echoed arguments made by the perpetrators themselves. The research was necessary, the information was unique, and the benefits outweighed the moral costs. This reasoning collapsed the distinction between those who committed atrocities and those who shielded them from consequences. Both groups chose expediency over principle, and both contributed to an outcome where victims were abandoned and perpetrators rewarded. In Japan, public reckoning with Unit 731 remains incomplete and contested. Official government statements have acknowledged the unit's existence and some aspects of its activities, but comprehensive apologies and reparations have not been forthcoming. Successive Japanese administrations have argued that legal claims arising from wartime conduct were settled by post-war treaties, including the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951 and bilateral agreements with China. These treaties addressed state-to-state reparations, but often left individual victims without recourse. Legal challenges brought by Chinese survivors in Japanese courts have faced procedural obstacles, including government assertions of sovereign immunity and expired statutes of limitations. While some Japanese judges have acknowledged in their rulings that atrocities occurred, they have generally declined to order compensation or official apologies, citing legal technicalities and separation of powers concerns. This creates a situation where historical facts are recognized in judicial findings, but victims still receive no remedy. Chinese civil society groups and historians have worked to preserve the memory of Unit 731 and to seek recognition for victims. The Memorial Hall of the Victims in Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders and the Exhibition Hall of the Evidence of Crime committed by Unit 731 of the Japanese Imperial Army in Harbin serve as sites of education and remembrance, attracting visitors from China and abroad. These institutions document not only what happened, but also the subsequent efforts to conceal it and the ongoing struggle for acknowledgement. Survivor testimony, though diminishing as witnesses age and pass away, continues to provide powerful evidence of the human cost of Unit 731's activities. Some survivors have traveled internationally to share their stories, speaking at universities, conferences, and public forums, in efforts to ensure that the crimes are not forgotten. Their testimony has been crucial in countering revisionist narratives that seek to downplay or deny Japanese wartime atrocities. In the United States, historical examination of the decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 has prompted reflection on the limits of realpolitik and the long-term costs of moral compromise. Some scholars argue that the deal exemplified Cold War pragmatism and was defensible given the geopolitical context of the late 1940s. Others contend that it represented a profound ethical failure that undermined the principles the Allies claimed to uphold in fighting the war. This debate extends beyond Unit 731 to broader questions about American post-war policy, including relationships with authoritarian regimes, support for leaders accused of human rights abuses, and willingness to overlook atrocities when they align with strategic interests. The Unit 731 case stands as one of the clearest examples of this pattern, where the choice was stark and the consequences undeniable. The intelligence gained was of questionable value. The crimes were unambiguous and the victims were entirely abandoned. The long-term impact on international law and medical ethics has been significant. The exposure of Unit 731, alongside the Nazi medical experiments prosecuted at Nuremberg, helped drive the development of international standards governing human experimentation and medical conduct during armed conflict. The Geneva Conventions, expanded and updated in 1949, included provisions prohibiting medical experiments on captives of war and civilians. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, established ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects, including requirements for informed consent and independent ethical review. These frameworks emerged partly in response to the atrocities committed during World War II, though their application has been uneven and enforcement often weak. The fact that Unit 731's leaders escaped prosecution, however, meant that one entire category of wartime medical crimes was never formally adjudicated at the international level, leaving a gap in the legal precedent and historical record. For modern audiences, the story of Unit 731 and the secret deal that followed raises uncomfortable questions about complicity, memory, and justice. It challenges the narrative that the post-war period represented a clear moral reckoning, where perpetrators were held accountable and victims received recognition. Instead, it reveals a more complicated reality where strategic considerations often trumped principle, where some crimes were prosecuted while others were concealed, and where the pursuit of knowledge or advantage could override the demands of justice. This history is not safely confined to the past. The ethical dilemmas it presents about when and whether to compromise moral standards in pursuit of other goals remain relevant. The challenge of balancing accountability with strategic interests continues to shape international relations and domestic policy debates. The Unit 731 case serves as a cautionary example of what happens when those in power choose expediency over principle, and when victims are deemed expendable in the calculus of national interest. Shiro Ishii died quietly in his bed, unpunished and unrepentant. The doctors and researchers who worked under him rebuilt their lives and careers, many achieving success and respectability. The thousands who suffered and died at Unit 731 were never acknowledged by those responsible, never mourned publicly, and never granted justice. The secret deal that made this possible was a deliberate choice by officials who knew what they were protecting and decided it was worth the cost. That decision shaped history in ways that continue to reverberate, influencing how wartime atrocities are remembered, how accountability is pursued, and who is allowed to forget. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss the next episodes. I'll see you next time on the channel.